On September 9th, 1942, in Brookings, Oregon, a small town along the state's southern coast, there was a bombing. The biggest misconception of World War II is the erroneous conclusion that the mainland United States was never bombed by an enemy aircraft during the war. Brookings, Oregon was in fact bombed in the depths of its forests, away from civilization. The bomb used is called an incendiary bomb. Incendiary bombs are built to explode into a bunch of tiny destructive pieces and to essentially start fires, and in this case, start a forest fire. Thankfully, it being the Pacific Northwest, the forest was wet from recent rain, so the fire didn't spread very far. The damage didn't succeed any further than some exploded trees and charred forest grounds. The bomb was dropped by a Japanese Navy pilot named Nobuo Fujita. Fujita was a chief warrant flying officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy.
In World War II, the Japanese patrolled up and down the west coast with submarines, very large submarines. They're called I-class submarines. And one of these submarines had an airplane on it. It was a fixed-wing aircraft that they could break apart and store in a hangar that was mounted on top of the submarine. And when the submarine would surface, crewmen would jump out of the submarine and assemble this plane from many parts, and then they were able to launch the aircraft down a catapult, a very long catapult, off the front of the submarine. They would use this airplane to do reconnaissance, in other words, spy on the Americans up and down the coast and over different military installations. On board one of these submarines was the pilot, Nobuo Fujita. He had an idea about attaching a bomb to one of his aircraft so that when he was out on reconnaissance, he could easily drop the bomb over the enemy target and easily make it back to the sub. His Japanese military commanders liked that idea, sent him to Oregon on one of these submarines with a reconnaissance aircraft, and his mission was to drop incendiary bombs over the southern Oregon coast, which was a deeply forested area. And the idea was to drop incendiary bombs that would spark fires. The hope was for the Japanese that these large forest fires would create panic up and down the coast, and it would cause the American military to pull their naval forces, which were positioned all around the Pacific Rim during World War II, that they would pull those forces back to the West Coast and protect the West Coast from Japanese attack, thereby opening up an avenue for success for the Japanese around the Pacific Rim. So Nobuo Fujita takes off from the submarine aboard his aircraft, which is armed with 2 incendiary bombs. He flies east inland about 8 miles until he gets to the forest, a nice dense forest, and circles a mountain, Mount Emily. This is just east of Brookings, about 8 miles on the southern Oregon coast. He drops 2 bombs, one of which actually does explode and creates a small fire, just about a quarter of an acre. It was an easy fire for forest rangers in the area to put out pretty quickly. And it also didn't help the Japanese cause that the forests were really damp from heavy rains earlier that week. Now, the reason so few people know about this bombing run is that the American government was pretty good at imposing blackouts on bad news during World War II. And the last thing the American government wanted was news about a Japanese attack on the American mainland. So they forbid the broadcast of any news about the event for many, many weeks. Indeed, many people never ever learned of the Japanese bombing of American mainland in 1942. So fast forward 20 years to 1962. The Brookings Harbor JCs are looking for some kind of event to bring some notoriety to the community, which is kind of sleepy and needs a little bit of help from an economic standpoint. They thought if they could come up with a big event that the whole world would know about, it would create some punch to the economy in town. So somebody had this idea about inviting the pilot back to Brookings, the very pilot who bombed nearby Mount Emily in 1942. Well, the idea got out. Word got out before the invitation was even made to Mr. Fujita, and boy, did it create big controversy in town.
Half the people were for the visit and half the people were against the visit. Protests and riots broke out and the town split in half.
There was very deep feelings, especially from veterans of World War II who were still living in the area and still had World War II very much fresh in their minds. So one of those JCs was my father, Norm Oberst. And my dad and the other JCs had quite a decision to make in the face of all this controversy. They had to decide whether to go ahead with the invitation and have Mr. Fujita in Brookings, host him, or call the whole thing off. So they had a meeting, they took a vote, but before they voted, they took one more look at their creed, their motto of the group. The JC's motto is, the brotherhood of man transcends the sovereignty of nations. And so, in sticking with their creed, they decide unanimously to go ahead with their plan and have Mr. Fujita in Brookings in May for their annual festival, the Azalea Festival. So the JCs go ahead with their invitation to have Mr. Fujita over for the Azalea Festival, and everybody holds their breath.
With FBI agents and police all over town, Mr. Fujita and his family show up safe and sound, with no protest.
Given all the protests and the upheaval leading up to his visit, it was rather surprising how welcoming the town was ultimately. And it's hard to say exactly why that was, except you could speculate that with all the FBI and police presence around town, it could be that protesters didn't want to get in any trouble. But it also could be that Mr. Fujita came off as just a regular guy, just doing his job in World War II, just like so many other veterans were doing, just following orders. Ultimately, this story of Nobuo Fujita in both his 1942 bombing run and his return visit in 1962 to Brookings is a story of courage, of perseverance on both parts, on the parts of the JCs and the people of Brookings and on the parts of Nobuo Fujita. And it was also a tremendous exchange of cultures and a greater understanding of two different countries.
You can visit the bomb site today, where you can learn more about the day the bomb was dropped and the day Fujita came back to make peace with Brookings, Oregon.